So like my advice, honestly, if I'm planning in a church setting, I probably have a total catalog of 40 contemporary songs, maybe a mix of hymns and old stalwarts that are making up the rest with a maximum of 50 to 60 songs. That's just looking at church attendance data. That's looking at how often people have to hear a song before they know it when they're not musical. I think another thing that musicians and creatives really struggle with is repetition. We love the idea of repetition in the moment, but we hate the idea of repetition over time. The guy on the Sunday morning who's leading his church and looking out at his people, if you take the resources as they're given uncritically without having an answer to why you are what you are and why you do what you do, then you really run the risk of just becoming another of what's already out there. Of like, well, wait a minute. This something about this being talked about feels icky. That is definitely out there. And I'm kind of going, you know what? Good.
Yep.
Good. Because what we need to be careful not to do is villainize the people who've benefited from it. They didn't actually make the system, and the system as it is isn't all that new. So if you look at Hymnody, for example, it was the case that hymn publishers were selling hymns by the thousands to churches all across the world, and somebody was making money. It just wasn't Fanny Crosby. So there was always money somewhere. The banana stand had a few bucks in it every time. It's just a question of what you do about it and how earnest and transparent we are about it.
All right, Elias, first question. Is it Dummer or Doomer?
It is Dummer, my friend. I've been trying to live it down my whole life, but it is Dummer.
That's the most. Okay, now we can end the podcast. That's really all I wanted to know. But so great to have you here on the Churchfront podcast show. And we've been talking about worship leader research now for a few months. Really like the work that you guys are doing. So
thanks.
Go ahead and give us the elevator pitch of worshipleaderresearch.com. Why does it exist and what are you guys up to?
Yeah, well, worshipleaderresearch.com is sort of a partnership of a few practitioners, industry people, and academics looking at what you might say is the intersection between the industry and the church. It's particularly important to me, having been in both chairs, I guess, having been a recording artist for a bunch of years, both with the City Harmonic and now on my own, and having been a worship pastor several times over. The fact that there's a relationship there that is so rarely looked at and examined, particularly by those in the kind of church side, I think is a really important thing. And so we're just hoping to help worship leaders have healthy conversations about how to engage the fact that there is an industry and machinery around all of this stuff.
Yeah, this is something that's been on my mind, our minds. Luke knows at Churchfront, we've always talked about the worship music industrial complex. We like to consider, even though I think we live in a great time where we have this gift to the church where there's so much great music being written, the technology to disperse the music very rapidly to local churches. Really, it seems like the whole music industry in general is being significantly disrupted. I think in positive ways that music writing is becoming more decentralized instead of just having the same labels behind all the stuff that we're listening to or watching online. Exciting times, but we have to be aware of, I think, some of the incentives that are in place out there and how the industry works and how that can really impact the local church worship ministries for the good or for not so good. So this is something that we've been talking about for a while now, and I'm really excited to kind of dive into some of these things. So what do you feel like for many of the listeners of Churchfront are worship leaders in small to mid-sized churches? They're also production leaders, or they're wearing both of those hats, especially in small churches. That's who we are at Churchfront, Luke and myself and the rest of the team. When I'm going about like looking for new songs for my congregation to sing at my local church, what advice do you give me or someone like me in my shoes of like how many songs should I have in a song library, or like what are the best sources for me to find new music, and what are maybe some of the pros and cons of each of those sources? So I'm not sure if one of those spurs any thoughts immediately for you.
Yeah.
What advice do you give worship leaders?
Man, I have a lot of thoughts on that. I don't want to give the impression, however, that some of these are a result of what we're doing through WLR. I am participating in worship leader research, not just because I'm in the industry and have been an artist and a worship songwriter, but also because before the band, the City Harmonic, even took off, I had started a marketing, research, and strategic consulting company. So I've been doing that for longer than I've been a known anything, for as much as people know me anyway in the music business. And so a lot of what I have to say on that has to do with kind of things we're learning to know, or we're getting to know about how it is that people retain information and that sort of thing, and less to do with the research at WLR. Although there's one question right at the very beginning, and I think you guys might have even covered this, which was to sort of ask, what is it? How do you feel about the quantity of new songs being promoted to you? Obviously, as more and more CCM artists participate in worship, as more churches see themselves, maybe you might say ambitiously, putting their worship leaders forward in a sense. And so that becomes part of what it means to be a successful church or a successful worship leader. Well, the volume of people writing worship songs that they hope might be consumed by others has gone up exponentially, right? And so, of course, the industry is building around that, which then means the funny thing when you get a decentralized market like that is that it tends to concentrate more and more towards the dominant known entities, because it's so much harder to build what you might call brand equity. So if, in a strictly marketing sense, the more players there are at the table, the more the biggest names are probably even bigger among the names that we have, if that makes sense. So that's not to say that those players are doing anything wrong or right. That's not the point at all. It's just that kind of how people work in groups, right? So like my advice, honestly, if I'm planning in a church setting, I probably have a total catalog of 40 contemporary songs, maybe a mix of hymns and old stalwarts that are making up the rest, with a maximum of 50 to 60 songs. That's just looking at church attendance data. That's looking at how often people have to hear a song before they know it when they're not musical. I think another thing that musicians and creatives really struggle with is repetition. We love the idea of repetition in the moment, but we hate the idea of repetition over time. And I think one of the biggest problems I see with that is all of the science. So, for example, if we want people to learn things, if there is some discipleship component to worship lyrics, which I think most of us would argue there ought to be, right? Then that is facilitated best by repetition with breaks in between, and not by repetition in the moment. The longer you sing the bridge has little to no bearing on whether or not the lyrics are remembered. It may have a relationship between a heightened emotional experience, but even that may not have a relationship to whether or not the lyrics are remembered. But a bunch of times playing that song over the span of months and years, that really matters. And I think what our research is building on is some research by Mike Tapper and Mark Joliker, who were two partners in our project, which was a few years ago. They showed that worship songs are coming and going at a rate faster than ever before. So we're playing songs, getting bored of them after 3 or 4 years, and then we no longer play them. In other words, we're treating Sunday morning like a radio station. And so we looked at that. I was an artist in the City Harmonic, frontman, wrote the songs. We played all over the place. I met Mike when he was a pastor in Canada. Now that he's an academic, I've taught at his school a few times and we've kept in touch. Well, my work in marketing and role in the industry made this a natural fit. And then we pulled in 2 other partners. And so we've all been kind of trying to build on what they discovered, which is, if we're seeing that songs are coming and going, to what extent do worship leaders understand that that isn't just happening? And to what extent might we use spiritual language inappropriately to perhaps veil some of the things that are happening? And I think it's better for everybody if we don't. And so in my mind, talking about repetition from a kind of human intellectual angle, helping people understand that it's humans that we're leading, even if we're empowered by the Holy Spirit, and that matters. And so, yeah, I would say maybe not so many songs. And although that's, not my position, not necessarily the position of the team, and probably play songs more often than you think you should, because it matters in the long run.
But Elias, they make it so easy to just play new songs every single Sunday, because I can just log into my multi-tracks account and I can load that new Brandon Lake song into Playback app, and I can actually play with all the backing tracks, so it doesn't even take
Oh
long
yeah,
for our band to learn it. It tells me what to
right.
do. I can put the lyrics and chords automatically on a pro presenter on a back wall. So the friction to learn these new songs is just so low, and they're just so
It
good.
really is. It really is.
It's the top of my Spotify playlist. I just have to introduce these songs to my congregation.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I suppose you could argue that. I mean, it depends on what you think worship is there to do at the end of the day. What is it that Sunday morning is for? And it's true that we're told to sing a new song. That's a good thing. I'm by no means, as a professional songwriter, saying, hey, we shouldn't write new songs at all. Not my point. Not my point. But I think you bring up a couple of things that are really interesting to me, which aren't really about the WLR thing again, but that's contextualization. I mean, worship seems to be the only ministry in, let's say, churches that might engage something like multi-tracks or that sort of thing, which practically rejects cultural contextualization and the kind of the location of place. So in other words, like if you're in Denver, right, your Denver sound and aesthetic is probably going to be different than the Redding, California sound and aesthetic or the Atlanta, Georgia sound and aesthetic. And it ought to be, because you're different people coming from different places. There is a degree to which we have a monoculture, but I think there is a healthy thing in some interpretation, which takes time and seeping and all of those things. And so I think for me, it's more practical and pastoral in that, like, yeah, it might be fun to play those new songs all the time, but if we're playing them because they're new and we like them, and we're not committing to them in such a way that Joe at the back, who wasn't going to love it no matter what, I mean, I think that's part of it. We very often play to the 1 in 5 people in the room who are already engaged in Christian music. 4 out of 5 people who attend churches, most churches, do not listen to Christian music outside of that Sunday morning, or very little. So they might listen to the songs you teach them that really connect with them, but by and large, they're not tuning into K-Love. Now, this isn't from the research. You can just get this data just by looking at Christian radio weekly listeners and attendance data. You just a simple comparison, and you're like, there are many, many, many more people going to church on a weekly basis than there are listening to Christian radio on a weekly basis. And that includes a lot of worship leaders, frankly. So we've kind of, when we take that sort of fast-paced production to Sunday, production to pulpit, if you will, when we take that sort of streamlined, boom, 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 here we go mentality, the problem with that is it takes a whole bunch of development time for the congregation for granted that actually isn't there for 80% of the room.
Before we continue on with the video, I want to tell you about our sponsor, the Churchfront Live Conference. It's a 2-day conference with keynotes and breakout sessions on topics like worship tech, worship theology, musicianship, and leadership. It is a great way to network with other like-minded ministry leaders in the Churchfront community. The sooner you purchase your Churchfront Live tickets, the greater the discount you will get with the early bird discount code. So head on over to churchfrontlive.com, use that early bird discount code at checkout, and I look forward to seeing you at the conference. Now let's get back to the video.
Wow. What kind of a assessment tool, or, I mean, from your perspective, as you've seen some of this stuff, how would you encourage planners and leaders who are thinking through the gathering? Like you mentioned a great question, like what's the purpose of the gathering? What is it there for? I mean, are there any kind of practical questions that you could ask to assess that as a leader, if you have mainly been a song leader for 6 years and you've just shown up and thrown set lists together, but you've never really asked that question? Is there any kind of guidance or assessment tools that you would recommend?
Well, I think it's largely contextual, and that depends on what denomination you're in and things like that. Not to give a overly complicated answer, but I think it's probably something you need to assess in partnership with the pastoral team, because that is ultimately a pastoral question. So however your church is structured, that's going to look very, very differently from place to place. Like for me, I happen to believe that worship on a holistic sense, so not just intellectually, but emotionally and physically in all the ways, is a practice of prayer, and it's a practice of formative prayer. So I'm kind of in the, like, I love contemporary stuff. That's what I do for the most part. But I love sort of engaging in like blended liturgical practice and things like that, and kind of musicalizing it and making it feel natural, but stuff that becomes familiar to people over time, that is distinct from, say, a song with a chorus and a bridge and that sort of thing. Because I ultimately believe worship is deeply formative. It is a discipleship act. And so but that's my belief. I mean, I think different contexts. I mean, depending on how Pentecostal or charismatic your church context might be, is going to have a really different answer to that question. So, for example, you might look at the idea of an encounter as being the thing which forms, and therefore anything which produces an outcome that seems like an encounter must be formative, as opposed to sort of. So there's a few different ways of looking at it, and I think it's probably down to your church, or at least your denomination, and figuring out it with your pastors. Because I could ask a million smart questions that a marketing consultant would ask, but that takes too much for granted, probably.
Totally. Yeah.
Yeah, I think we have similar philosophies of worship along the lines of it being very formative. There's books that we've recommended folks checking out, like Gospel Centered Worship by Brian Chappell, James Smith's work on Desiring the Kingdom, and there's just like some really well thought out things that a lot of it's going back to. I remember in Smith's work, he looks back at the even earlier writings of Augustine and just early church fathers, and the whole concept of your habits form your desires, which
I'm a big Jamie Smith guy. I love that stuff. Yeah,
I like his book. I like those books. His recent like political takes have kind of got off the rails for me.
Yeah, that's very true. But I think the thing for me that he speaks to, which he comes at it from a philosophical angle, and I think what's interesting is that in kind of the neuroscience and behavioral economics world, we're coming to really similar places that we're seeing from data that people are far more likely to act out of their habits than they are their beliefs. Their beliefs shape very little of. So it's not even just that, like, and this is going to be totally James K. Smith stuff, but like, it's not even just that we're teaching people the right sentences to say in the right order when we sing songs. There's something emotionally that's happening. We're teaching people to desire and want the same thing, or the right things, let's say. And so I think it's, and that's where a lot of the conversation around manipulation comes up and stuff like that. And it's valid, but it's also what all music is doing. So there's a sense in which, like, we are coaching the whole body in the act of singing in a special way. And I think, if we don't wrestle with the question we asked at the beginning of this segment, I guess, if we don't ask questions about whether we care and the degree and why, then we're just doing it by accident. And I think that's kind of scary.
Then I wonder if you could develop a hypothesis to say that the worship music industrial complex has because of the quantity of new songs that are being released, even if the songs are great on their own, there's nothing theologically wrong with them, but they have a negative effect on the potential positive atomic habits that a congregation member could develop. I like the book Atomic Habits. It's kind of a newer one by James Clear, but he talks about making any positive change in your life is usually coming from the small little changes that are within your control, and you can repeat doing these things daily until that's when you get the outcome. And I think even your desires change, right? Like if you start make diet changes or exercise changes, you get to a point where you're like, a bag of Doritos sounds disgusting to me now, where maybe 6 months ago it sounded awesome. And like in worship, how do we get to a point where people can, just the way they conduct their moral lives, be like, okay, this vice or this selfishness sounds disgusting and repulsive to me, rather than the way of the kingdom, so to speak. So
I think that's a great thought. Yeah, I mean, this is sort of why I've been saying every time we do a podcast, anyone on our team, we're pretty quick to point out that, like, this reads like a research project about the music industry, but it isn't. It's ultimately a research project about the real gatekeepers when it comes to this stuff. And those gatekeepers are Joe, the average worship leader. Like that because they are largely unaware of the degree to which they hold power. And it used to be that things like CCLI shaped things with it was a lagging indicator, they call it in marketing. So in other words, it was 6 months to a year or more behind the trend which drove its success, right? So there was a degree to which we could see what was happening 6 months ago and then hope that was close enough. And I think, like with many verticals in the internet, you're seeing that window just get shorter and shorter to the point where we're seeing practically real-time data with live music streaming and that sort of thing. And multitracks is a great example, actually, of that, where you can see something that is released And then you can see purchase quantity within days. So
Yeah.
that seemed like Planning Center charts is another great example. A new song that gets picked up like crazy suddenly really matters. And that didn't used to be possible at all. So now you have this kind of entire ecosystem of reporting, which creates social proof. So you kind of get this, well, everybody else likes it, so I probably like it, which just so happens to be how most of us engage most music.
Well, I was going to ask, have you reached out to Multitracks or Planning Center or CCLI for worship leader research sake to get data?
Yeah, I mean, we're starting to have conversations about exactly what that needs to look like. We had a bunch of worship leaders upload their PCO data, but it was in such a way that it was, not surprisingly, a lot of worship leaders who use PCO didn't have the entire history of the church in their PCO. They had their own tenure available. And so that made it really hard to aggregate the data in a meaningful way. So I also know briefly from conversations at PCO, because this hasn't been a major focus of theirs, that I would assume whatever data we would get from PCO in the long run might need some work to organize, just because it's not, they're not publishing reports on a regular basis. So I can only assume they would be if they were organizing the data themselves. So, and I don't know about privacy stuff too, but we're certainly interested in having those conversations as we look ahead to kind of looking at trends over 3 to 5 years and that sort of thing. I think the thing for us right now is just, and I think, Christy at CT is trying to do this and others, is it's just like, hey, it would be really healthy for us to have transparent conversations about the business nature of the machinery behind this, as if there's some like worship music cabal, like people scheming in a back room about what the next song is going to be. Knowing enough of those guys, I don't think that's how it works. I think at the end of the day, people respond to songs by a bunch of different mechanisms, and that's super complicated. But the guy on the Sunday morning who's leading his church and looking at his people, if you take the resources as they're given uncritically without having an answer to why you are what you are and why you do what you do, then you really run the risk of just becoming another of what's already out there every week. Just another, you're not serving your congregation, you're just repeating the things that exist. It's like social media almost. And so I think there's really something to just really digging down at some point. It probably not when you're 21, but at some point digging down and going, okay, what do we as a church believe this Sunday morning thing is for? And what do songs have to do with that? And where do we go from there? And then engage the industry from there with your eyes wide open. I think that's really healthy.
Yeah, I agree. I don't think there's some, people meeting in some room somewhere trying to like pull the strings or whatever. Maybe there is, who knows? But I don't think that's happening.
There are definitely meetings in rooms. It's just a question.
Exactly. Well, and even to get back to one of the first things you stated about how, yes, worship songwriting is becoming decentralized because anybody can write and record and publish now, but you're seeing the bigger players kind of just become bigger. The big four churches, or was it Bethel, Elevation, Passion, Hillsong?
Yep.
And you wonder. It's what, like, Luke and I were having dinner last night, and we were chatting about this and stuff about just there's a lot of really big money moving around in all this stuff too. And trying to understand the economic incentives that are happening and how that turns into why all these songs are being produced. Because why does a Hillsong or a Red Rocks or a Life Church, like, why is there that urgency for them to want to write a lot of original songs for the local church? Because there's obviously a lot of great songs out there already, but like, what drives that need? And is it, even though it can produce some great tools for their church to be able to sing and worship together and then share with other churches out there, I won't deny that. Is it coming from a primarily marketing business strategy incentives? Because when, think about, would anybody know a Brian Houston if it weren't for Hillsong worship? Or and would Hillsong be a global phenomenon if it weren't for Hillsong worship?
Right.
Probably not. Would Hillsong have a $500 million budget? I can't remember what it is now, but if it wasn't for the music. So it's like, and I would like to answer like, no, a lot of these churches, like, they tend to rapidly expand more. Music can be a catalyst for it.
Oh,
okay.
definitely.
So, and that's a good, or that can be a positive thing. I'm not saying it's a bad thing, but should that be what informs the types of songs that we're using for discipling our local churches? That's where that critical thinking needs to come in at the individual worship leader level.
Right. I totally agree. And the thing is, like, we can look to, and it's funny, you see this sort of in the attitudinal research. So down, I think it was question 6, and question 7, like, where do you find new songs? And, to what extent do you rank the value of CCLI charts or Planning Center charts? And most people don't view it very positively. They're largely neutral towards the idea of charts. And some of that, honestly, is, and the same thing when you look at, say, advertising or Christian radio, they would say, oh, I view it even negatively. I don't like ads. Everyone would report, as all marketers will tell you, everyone would report, I don't like advertising. And yet everyone would report that I clicked on an email campaign this month. I mean, it's just kind of how it works. People view things negatively and say and predict their behavior in a way that is different from what they actually do. So the average worship production guy is really tight on time. He's stretched thin. He might be overeducated. He might be undereducated, but I don't know that we've found the balance of exactly preparing people for the models that exist in terms of how Sunday morning works, And so I think there's a lot of questions people are having to ask all the time, which leads what's going to happen in 5 days or in 11 days or whatever to be a kind of a tyranny of the urgent. I think very often. I don't know if you guys feel that, but they're sort of like, what's the sermon series? You're just plugging in. And not to say that that's bad or good. I actually don't think it's necessarily the end of the world as long as we've done good work in terms of our catalog and stuff like that. But people are looking at these things and they're saying, well, I don't know what to do. I'm tight on time, and click, click, click. Pulling in, and so it's just a hard thing to tease out because it reveals, you might say, other soft points in the system. We do tend to, I mean, what is it they say? I think it's like people have a capacity for up to 7 brands in a given vertical. In other words, you could probably name 7 brown sodas, and you might not even be able to name 7 brown sodas, right?
Yeah.
So there's a sense in which, like, there's just a limited capacity to name all the things we want to name. And so people tend to group up and tribe up and figure it out. And so while Hillsong and so on have, been fueled by music, it's also just true that people make emotional decisions most of the time. In fact, almost all decision making is emotional. There was research done on people with what's called split brain syndrome, where an injury has caused them to separate their sort of rational processing centers of the brain from action and choice making, right? And when that injury is present, those people can't even make simple choices in many cases, or they make such bad choices that you don't want them choosing. And so there is a sense in which our emotions directly inform our ability to choose at all. And so it also then makes sense that music could fuel growth and popularity because, well, when we sing together, our brains fill with oxytocin, which is a trust hormone. So there's a sense in which, like, we're just trusting the creators of these things. We're trusting these artists and therefore trusting the engines that fuel them if we're not thoughtful. Now, again, I'm not saying these engines are bad. That's not my point at all. I don't fault them for wanting to reach people with what they're doing as people organically respond to it. But I do think it's cause, as we've been saying all along, to have healthy, transparent, and open conversations about it, and not necessarily do what is often the case in American evangelicalism. This is not even about music, but American evangelicalism in general, which is to say that when something has a lot of money, God must have done it.
Wow.
And so if we're not willing to call that into question, this is what we'll always be doing. We have to stop and say, okay, what does it mean in the kingdom to be blessed? What does it mean in the kingdom to thrive? How patient is God? I mean, you look at the idea of the Roman Empire versus the Christianization of the Roman Empire versus say the death and resurrection of Jesus, right? That's like 400 years. One of the fastest growing movements in history by modern American standards would have been a statistical failure. That ought to alert us to, our impatience and the way that we look at data. I look at data for a living. This is a big part of what I do, is geek out on this stuff. But what marketers will always do is say, okay, why do you need to know how many clicks are on that part of your website? Because it's really, really easy to create a website which gets a lot of clicks on a particular button. But what if they're the wrong clicks? What if that button doesn't go where you need them to go? So if you don't stop and answer the questions along the way, then optimizing for a particular data piece is just going to give you the outcome you want. And it may not. Dallas Willard talks about that. The system, and other business people, the system you have is ideally designed to give you the results that you have, you know? And so if you want to do things differently or better, if you value worship, and then stop and look at the system.
Man, that's some golden stuff right there. Yeah. No, I think the point you brought up about time and a lot of worship leaders feeling urgency. There's a lot of tools out. A lot of these tools and these companies explicitly say, like a Multitracks, I love those guys, I know those guys, and they're like, yeah, our mission is to save worship leaders time. Like that's their biggest thing, right? And it's great. And at the same time, we can take that convenience, and then we also observe the potential to be like, hey, what if I'm not contextualizing our worship to my congregation because I'm trying to save too much time? It's like, okay, well, you know, it's just, you can get really philosophical about this stuff in general. Like, though, that's kind of what, you know, society at large, when you think about, you have to be careful about just trying to save time, because you go to fast food restaurant because you're trying to save time. It's like,
Totally.
If you keep doing that, that's not going to end well.
Yeah. Well, and the funny thing is, if you look at it from that's a great illustration. It's one of the illustrations I use most often. You get people in a room to say, hey, how many of you think McDonald's is good for you? And you'll quickly see there are no hands in the room, right? Or maybe like a snarky teenager will put their hand up just to mess with you, right? And then you say, okay, how many of you have eaten fast food in the last 3 months? And then you just start counting down.
Yep. Chick-fil-A.
And you just look at the hands in the air, right? Nobody thinks it's good for them, and everybody's doing it. Mm-hmm. So it's not like we go, oh, there's a good reason, now my behavior will change. It's stuff that changes with repetition and investment and time and some thought. I mean, it informs that. But at some point, we have to feel that thing in order to make that change. And I think some of what's interesting about our work, as we're talking about it, I mean, I'm talking about it with people in the industry, I'm talking about it with CT or the average worship leader, it doesn't matter. There's this sort of like, well, wait a minute, something about this being talked about feels icky. That is definitely out there. And I'm kind of going, you know what? Good.
Yep.
Good. Because what we need to be careful not to do is villainize the people who've benefited from it. They didn't actually make the system, and the system as it is isn't all that new. So if you look at hymnody, for example, it was the case that hymn publishers were selling hymns by the thousands to churches all across the world, and somebody was making money. It just wasn't Fanny Crosby. So there was always money somewhere. The banana stand had a few bucks in it every time. It's just a question of what you do about it and how earnest and transparent we are about it. Yeah, man, these tools are fantastic. I would say one thing on that, when it comes to whether or not we're saving time, I actually think we're moving time.
Interesting.
So in the 90s, when I started leading worship when I was a kid, so it was in the 90s. And then when I was 12, it was thin pickings at church, I guess. But by the time I was a worship pastor, I think I was maybe 22, something like that, when I first started. And didn't start with the title of pastor, that's for sure. But we'd have a Thursday night rehearsal. It was par for the course. Everyone was there. It was 3-4 hours long. Everyone would go home. It was a great community thing. It was before tracks, right? Really before click as well, in terms of having it normalized. And we'd play then, and we'd play Sunday morning. And by no means was it as good as things can be now with tracks and click and call outs and that sort of thing. But that time was there. Now, most guys I know doing multi-tracks, if they're putting any thought, they are putting 2 to 3 hours into arranging an Ableton set. Mm-hmm. So they moved it. They saved an hour. And they increased the quality, if you will, on Sunday mornings, certainly. And the question is, has that just increased in general with expectations around worship and that sort of thing? Would playing with click and call-outs and cues and maybe less tracks, a little bit here and there, to open the door for more interpretation at the congregational level, like all the boxes potentially. So there's a lot of different ways of looking at it, I think, that could allow for both. But it all, not to sound like a broken record on this interview, but it all stems from why you do it.
Yep.
It's good. Man, as I was looking over the report too, Elias, I mean, and one of the things that Churchfront talked about and had questions regarding to was like, how, or do you see you guys getting more data into these? Because, obviously you talked about some of the heavy hitters in terms of artists and things like that. Do you guys have plans to add into that and backgrounds and nominations of worship leaders? Like, what's the future of this data look like as you guys hope to kind of continue to gather more data and help hopefully inform more worship leaders? Can you give us a perspective on that?
Yeah, totally. I mean, it's in discussion in terms of what is coming next from us and how we're going to frame that. I mean, just for a bit of context, part of why what we called phase one of our data was the sort of state of the industry in a sense, was because we had to generate that in order to look at how worship leaders are approaching the industry. If you don't have a good sense of what you're trying to measure, there's nothing to measure against. And so we kind of did phase one based on loose what's working at CCLI, or what are we seeing? We had the CCLI data and that sort of thing. So for another round of this, whether it's 3 years, 5 years, 10 years, that sort of thing, for another round of this to exist would sort of require us getting upfront data and then looking at attitudes and improvements around how to measure how worship leaders view that data. So there's sort of always necessarily two prongs to it. I think there are certain questions, like a lot of what we did in the survey report, which is linkable if you just go to worshipleaderresearch.com, it's right on the menu. A lot of what's there isn't necessarily reliant on the state of the industry, but some of it really, really is. And so I think it's just figuring out which thing to focus on. So we're totally in discussion about that. I think we plan to continue working together on the question and the problem, but I think exactly what that's going to look like is still up in the air.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Well, I am pumped to have you coming to Churchfront Live this year in October.
Yeah, I'm excited.
So that'll be shortly after we publish this podcast. If you guys are listening in August or September here of 23. And I think I put your keynote to be like how the worship music industrial complex works or something like that.
Yeah.
We'll massage that title as it approaches and stuff. But you're coming from Canada, right? You said
yes.
The Toronto area.
Yeah, so I lived in Nashville the last 10 years, but we just moved back to Hamilton, just outside Toronto, about a year ago. So back in my hometown, and excited to be out your way.
And what are you up to other than helping out with worship leader research? What do you do what's your day job?
Oh man. So, I mean, I'm still in music. I still am making records and putting that out. I have been an entrepreneur a long time. So I own an art gallery, which is doing great here in town, and online art business. And I run and own a marketing agency. I basically have 6 companies. So it's, I'm grateful that that's got me to a place where I have time to spend on things like this. And I'm able to be a creative first and foremost, and I'm glad. Yeah, so I'm helping out at church and that sort of thing.
Yeah. Cool. Well, really appreciate the work that you're doing, and excited to meet you in person here soon. But thanks so much. And where can folks follow you on your socials? Oh yeah, I mean, my very weird name does the trick most of the time. So if you look up Elias Dummer, practically anywhere, you'll probably find me. EliasDummer.com is a website, and to keep up with what we're doing at Worship Leader Research, you can just head to worshipleaderresearch.com.
Cool, love it. That was awesome.
Awesome. Guys. Yeah, thanks, guys.